about you that they don't want you to know about yourself. Our young Ethiopian brother is on what is called the tankwas or the papyrus boat. These papyrus boats, when you understand and see the culture, as he's moving along on the tankwas boats, they're still used on Lake Tana today. And also we see in ancient Egypt, although you see it on the monuments, in Egypt, you see the king, the sultan, on the papyrus boat with the sikkim, and you see it in Ethiopia. It's alive in Ethiopia, but on the monuments in Egypt. Still going on, it's still passed down. We go to tankwas were made on the lakeside of Ethiopia and Bahadar. These boats that are still there, still used. The practice of making the tankwas are still going on to this very day as we see our brother moving along on the tankwas with the boat. But yet when we go to Kemet and we see that here it is carved on the stones right there, but it's still in practice in Ethiopia. An ancient culture. So in Kemet we see it on the release, but in Ethiopia the culture that was passed from Ethiopia into Kemet, we see it on the monuments and temples as I'm observing right here in Bahadar, the ancient tankwas. But if one doesn't know the culture, you just bypass this and not even know the connection. As I observed them and I looked when I was there and I reflected on, I said, I've seen these boats on the temples of Egypt where they're carved and the culture is still passed down. These are the boats that we also came across the Atlantic Ocean with. This documented by a man named Heiderdal, who proved that Africans came across the Atlantic Ocean by building the Ra expedition when the Cushites had their own boats. This is long before slave ships coming across the Atlantic Ocean. We see the Cushite Africans came across the Atlantic Ocean. They left big Olmec heads that are still there. And they try to make up all kind of psychopathic racist statements about them that I deal with in my other presentations. Drusilla Dunjee Houston and her book right here called The Wonderful Ethiopians of the Ancient Kushite Empire. And here in her book, she talked about how ancient Kushites, who also inhabited the land of Egypt, Arabia, Mesopotamia, as far away as India, as I also mentioned. And she gave us a lot of information. In her book, she speaks of where Herodotus, where he says in book 3, the Ethiopians say that the Egyptians are the colony drawn out of them by Osiris that we call Asar, and that Egypt that we called Kemet was formerly no part of the continent, but a sea at the beginning of the world, and that it was afterwards made land by the river Nile. That means the Nile flowing, carrying the topsoil, that's what even made Egypt. Okay? And here we see those early deities. Here we see the first kingship, divine kingship, with Asar, who the Greeks called Cyrus. Jet black. Jet black because of the African Kushites who were jet black, and showing that all the deities are coming from the south, coming from the Kushite nation, but we had that divine bound netter hedge and she been a netter hemp. That means the divine husband and the divine wife, the netter hedge and the netter hemp. That means Asar and Aset with the throne on her head. These were the early spiritual deities of the spiritual story of divine balance, where the creation story of man and woman were created simultaneously, as I deal with in my African history versus biblical myths. But as we look and see, they also call the Remeti, the pre-dynastic Kushite, Kemet African heads in the Cairo Museum. These were the ancient Africans that came up out of the beginning of the Nile, where the heads are still right there in the Cairo Museum. When we start with the first African king named Norma, who reunited Upper and Lower Egypt, because we always tried to reunite the nation, to keep the nation together, the North and the South, as we see Norma did during his time setting up the capital of Menefer. But when you look and see in the Cairo Museum, clearly see from his features that this is an Oromo African that came up from the south as even-breasted, or Petri, excuse me, who points out the Oromo type of Abyssinia, as they call it, according to Petri, making Egypt. And here Petri is showing that here, that the Oromo, this is how the people of Kemet, the kings or sultans, came from the Oromo nation of the Kushite Ethiopia. As we see Sneferu, who built that first true pyramid. These were the African Oromo who came up out of the south. We see Sahora, Nepka, over 2,400 years BCE. He was a sultan called the Sons of Ra. But you look closely at Sahora and look at his features and see that his features go back to the Oromo Ethiopian hammer. So this is where Europeans try to say the Egyptians are white. They came up out of the Kushite Empire. They came up out of ancient Kush. As you can see, the Oromo sister right here. and look and see a closer view of his features, it's identical to the Oromo culture, like Neferkara Pepi II over 4,200 years BCE. Was there a Rome yet? No. Was there a Greece yet? No. Was there a Western world yet? No. Did not exist yet during the time of these ancient African Kushite nations, Neferkara Pepi II over 4,000 years ago. He also made an expedition back to Punt, just like Zahora, who made an expedition back to Punt, because that was the Kui land, that was the spirit land that we had to return back to, and here he connected with the Twa, because the Twa, our ancestors said that they were the children of God. They were the seed people that came up out of the beginning of the Nile, as we see in the Heptrial, Mentuhotep of the 11th dynastic period, over 4,000 years ago, a Wasetian, a king of Upper Egypt. Here, Jet Black, because he was from the Kushites, who came up from the south, Jet Black. It came up out of the south. It didn't come from Mesopotamia. It didn't come from all these other places they try to tell us. As we see the Tanihisi, Kushite soldiers from the land of the bow of Taseti. And we see them here because it is here that they excavated Mentuhotep's temple and got these soldiers. But notice that they're holding the sticks for battle right here. So when we go back to Musi land, and we can see the same culture among the Musi, the Donga sticks that they use for fights. To this very day that are used, but you see them in the Cairo Museum among the Tanihisi that was carried down the Nile. The Tanihisi Kushite Ethiopians are also, we see from the art, and these blades or rings are around their hand that they use for fights. But let's go and see, when I was in the Bume village of Ethiopia, here January 6th, we see our brother is wearing the band around his hand they use for fights for the Bume. But his culture, you see him here, it goes all the way back to the Kushite nation. And on the temples of Kemet, you can see the African defense system and see that that culture started with African people. It was called the Mantu art form from the temple of Medina Habu. Rock carvings of the Mantu art form, that was the African defense system called martial arts today, which is a Roman god of war. We need to stop saying martial arts. Long before the martial arts and the Chinese had it, you got it carved in stone of the African defense system called Jiu-Jitsu and karate and all these things today, as you see the flips and so forth and the hands, and also you can see the arrow where we see the stick fighting that he's also using. But when I went to Brazil, and I went to Bahia, Brazil, and right there in Bahia, Brazil, I see the brothers here, Caparello, where we brought this across the Atlantic Ocean. It's called Caparello, and we see him with the stick fighting just like we saw it on the temples of Egypt. And behind him, that's a slave castle, where Brazil also had slave castles, just like the Cape Coast in West Africa and Ghana, and also in Senegal, where we go many times as well, like Elmina. But this is the African defense system that we carried across the Atlantic Ocean called Caparello, and that's me right there in the middle, where they are showing me the African defense system called Caparello, but you see it right there on the temples of Egypt over 3,000 years ago. These are books in stone that our ancestors left us. And you see them with the stick figures for the fighting right here. Also, we see go among the Nuba, who their wrestling styles and compare their wrestling styles are identical to those that are right there in Kemet. So we got it. We can see it on the temples of Kemet, and we can see the wrestling styles are identical to what you see in ancient Kemet. As when we went into the village, and the Bume village in southern Ethiopia, the Kara as well, and we can see our brother right here. Brother Kisa, thank you. Kisa, who came with us, he's one of the brothers I selected to come into this region of Ethiopia, and you see him with our brother right here with the ring around his hand, defense system, and Brother Kisa went to fight with him. I said, brother, you can't mess with that, brother. He got a blade on his hand. He went through a quick move, and blood started running all down his arm. Okay, so it was a quick move, but the brother was just defending himself because Kisa was trying to do something fast on him, but the brother was ready for him, but you can see where his culture is still passed down from the ancient Kushites. But let's look at the Ta-Nehisi Kushite Ethiopians called Nubians today and see what the Greeks, who the Herodotus called the Ethiopians the tallest and most beautiful and long-lived of the human races. Homer refers to the Ethiopians as the most just of men, the favorite of the gods. Herodotus wrote that the Ethiopians have the oldest tradition which men honor the deity. So we see the oldest tradition of honoring God came from the Kushite Ethiopians. And also we see that they gave libation back to Ethiopia. In the Iliad and the Odyssey, they said we must return back to Ethiopia to replenish our ideas and our religion. So they had libation bowls. When we look at in the Iliad of Homer wrote, Zeus and the Olympiad gods feasted for 12 days with the blameless Ethiopians. So here that means that, you mean tell me the Greek gods came and feasted with the Ethiopians, and you can see the African heads on these libation bowls where they gave libation back to Africa? This is right here in the Greeks' libation bowls. But we go back to Kemet and see the sultans or kings like Amenemhet I, whose names meant Amen, is in the head, established the worship of Amen and the oldest state religion of Kemet. Okay, he built the Taneter, or the divine house, the Neterhet, or divine house for Amen, called Ipedasud. Also we see, here's the God he's worshiping, Amen, that we still say Amen at the end of our prayers. The hidden spirit that's in all of us, the hidden spirit that permeates throughout the whole universe. Of jet black, why is he jet black? Because he represents the Cushite deity that Amen has in his name. We see, thank you, sister. We see where the locks came from. Let's go back to Africa in the Cairo Museum of Amenemhet III, the 12th dynastic period. Okay, 1843 to 1797 BCE, Amenemhet with the locks. So the locks is an ancient culture from the Oromo-Cushitic Africans, the Oromo-Cushitic Kemetic Africans of the Nile Valley. Kenumit Amen Ma'akdara Hatshepsut, 1484, 1462 BCE. She wanted to return back to her spirit homeland, back to the Taneter land, back to the Holy Land. So it's carved on her temple of her expedition back down to the land of Punt. And that would be the area of Adulis in Ethiopia. Here's the return back there to pay homage, to bring back myrrh and spices and so forth. As we see here, she met the Queen of Paria, as Mary Ra has dealt with in her other presentations, and we see her where the Europeans got the bustles from, okay? Went from Paria as she went back to pay homage to Ethiopia. So that Kemet always paid homage because this was the spirit land. Ethiopia and the origin of civilization, John G. Jackson points out in his book, the traditions current concerning Memnon are interesting. He was claimed as a king by the Ethiopians and identified with the pharaoh Amenhotep III, the Egyptian. A fine statue of him, okay, is located in the British Museum in London. Charles Darwin makes the reference to this statue in his Descent of Man, which is well worth reproducing. When I looked, this is Charles Darwin, when I looked at the statue of Amenhotep III, I agree with two officers of the establishment, both competent judges, that he had a strongly marked so-called Negroid type or Negro type of features. The features of Akhenaten, Amenhotep IV, are even more Negroid than those of his illustrious predecessors. That the earliest Egyptians were African Ethiopians, Nilotic Negroes is obvious to all unbiased students of Oriental history, okay? Now, this is the sculpture that they're talking about, Ne'ba'at Ra Amenhotep III, over 3,000 years ago, known as our dazzling son. He was also a diplomatic sultan, okay, who corresponded with other nations. And they said, well, the reason why he looked this way because he wanted a more stylized version. That's why they carved his lips that way. But he made his lips that way because that's exactly how he looked. These are his statues in the West Bank, right there in Kemet and Upper Kemet, going to the West Bank. That's the Valley of the Kings. You'll see these two statues here, although in ruins. But the Greeks said that these statues was Memnon. Memnon was an Ethiopian king that came to the rescue of the king of Troy, and he brought Ethiopian soldiers as well as soldiers from Mesopotamia and Susa and other areas to help fight in the Trojan War. And that's the legend about him. But actually, it's not Memnon, it's Amenhotep III. And you see him right here, carved on the side. As you can see, he is an African Cushite. As we take a closer look at his features, he's a Romo, Cushite, Kemetic African of the Nile Valley. As we see his features very close, and he identified himself as the Neb-Karu. That means Lord, King of Kings. This is where the earliest term of Lord, King of Kings come right here, as you can take and put your hand 5 inches into the Medu Neter. That's how deep we carved this early in first language. He was also called the Sarah, or the Son of God. Here at Ta-Nehisi, or Nubia, okay, or the tomb of Hoi, viceroy of Ta-Nehisi during the reign of King Tutankhamun around 1300 BCE. Now at this time, depending on who ruled, sometimes Kemet ruled, sometimes we see that, my mic cut off, sometimes we see that also that the Kushites ruled. I think this mic might, so I'll just try to talk louder, okay? When you go to Abu Simbel, you can see the 2 monuments showing the unity of Upper and Lower Egypt. Again, where Ramesu married the Ta-Nehisi daughter, and that is Nefertari II, showing the unity of the 2 nations. The Parteta, the house of eternity, dedicated to the Neterah, Ra-Harakte, Het-Heru. Again, we can see these massive colossals here where Ramesu also built a temple for his queen, his favorite queen, and his favorite queen was a Ta-Nehisi or Nubian that came up from the south. So you see the unity that our ancestors kept between the two lands of Kemet and also Ta-Nehisi, are called Egypt and Nubia today. Upper and Lower Nubia, just like Upper and Lower Egypt. Now we're going to go down to the area called Napata, that early African king during the time of the Kushites during this period, Kushata around the 24th dynastic period, around 760 or 747 BCE, he was a Ta-Nehisi Nubian ruler of Napata. His influence was as far north as Waset, that is ancient Kemet. We see the great colossals that are still there of this great Kushite ruler who influenced also Kemet, because at this time they were trying to keep the unity of the land and bring the land back as one African nation as it was in ancient times. And we see that his son Pianki of the 25th dynastic period around 700 BCE, the son of Kushata, he also continued his father's trying to unify the land. That means Upper and Lower Kemet. And he ruled all the way and conquered all the way to the delta. Pianki began the process of restoring Ma'at, that means truth, justice, and righteousness in Kemet or Tamari. And it was during this time the Sultan King Pianki was strike swiftly, and he became the Sultan of Kemet, defeating the Libyans who invaded Kemet in the area of the delta. And he was buried with his horses because he had a great love for the horses, and the Kushites had a great love for the horses during this time. His brother, Neferkara Shabaka, the Kushite king of the 25th dynastic period around 700 BCE, he also continued to conquer to make sure to unify of the land. So again, they saw it is all one. It was all one culture. It was not separated. Shabaka, brother of Pianki, he brought the entire Nile Valley as far as the delta under the empire of the Kushites. Taharka of the 25th dynasty around 600 BCE. Taharka, this African king right here, is told by Eratosthenes, was quoted in Strabo saying that Taharka was a warrior who penetrated into Europe as far as the Pillars of Hercules known as Gibraltar. And he would call himself the emperor of the world during this time. Europeans have said all types of negative things about him, but these are the great African Kushite warriors, and you can go to what is called the Sudan today and see in Nori the pyramids that they built there as well, and showing the royal tombs. And when we look at Jebel Bakel, Napata, the ancient capital of both Kush, okay, and sometimes Kemet, and also Meroe, but the ancient mountains and the Holy Land and the Holy Mountains, Jebel Bakel is still there today. And that was the holy mountain of Kush. It was called Jua, that the Arabs called Jebel Bakel today. And although you see that the ruins of this ancient temple that was once at the foot of this sacred mountain, you can still see some of the ruins here today, but it was the holy mountain of the spirit of Amen. Now, as I said, if a man named Moses lived, he had to pass by this holy mountain. So did he get the story of Mount Sinai from the holy mountain of Amen? The same Amen that we still say at the end of our prayers, who is jet black, Amen, the hidden one, the hidden spirit that's in all of us, the hidden spirit that permeates throughout all the universe. And Jebel Bakel was dedicated to Amen, and you see the zoop type that was used was the ram. 2,000 years ago, the sun was in the constellation of the ram. As we look and see, just like in Waset and Kemet, you see the ram is still used even in ancient times, showing that they were one culture, one civilization of the African Nile Valley, and here was the mother, and this ancient temple that was built there was built for Amen, just like the temple that was built in Kemet right here at Ipet Asut for Amen as well. But the mother came from Kush. So again, we see it's all one culture of the Nile Valley, the temples that were built in the ancient Kushite empire, Kushite Kemet, we see identical also in Kemet, dedicated to Amen. Jet black, because the people saw God in their image, they were jet black. So that's why when the Kushites came into Kemet, they didn't destroy. They built, and because they knew Amen came up out of the south. And when we look and see why did they have this mountain associated with Amen, it may be by this little piece from this mountain right here, because when you look at that piece, it looks just like the uraeus. That was one of the Kemetic symbols, as we look at it very closely and see that the Kushites gave praise to uraeus. It was the symbol of the kings in this area right here, and we see Amen associated with the uraeus. That was the symbol that they used. Now this is important because the Kush ruled over the Axumites. And there's a story in the Tigray region of telling of where here we see that maidens had to be sacrificed to Ori, and Ori was the serpent. And we see right here the Aksumite dynasty started around 1370 BCE. Its founder is said to have been Zabazi, and Gobel, who replaced an older dynasty called the Serpent Dynasty, Ori. Now this is the same legacy that's carried with a queen named Makeda, also named Saba, that you may know as Sheba. Now the Serpent Dynasty was actually the Kushite dynasty. This goes back to the pendulum again, where one point Kush was in power and controlled the area of the Aksumite or the Tigray region. So this is where this legacy is passed down, and when we look at who was the Serpent Dynasty, those were the Kushites, and their symbol was the Uraeus. So that legacy was passed down into the highlands of Ethiopia and the Tigray region, which is still carried on today. It's talking about the serpent who was, and all the maidens who had to be sacrificed to the serpent goddess, and then also this is where Ngobel saved Makeda from being sacrificed. This is all part of an African legacy of the Nile Valley when Kush ruled Aksum during this time. Now, when we get into the land of Aksum, as you see the circle right there, this is a civilization at this particular period that many of us don't know much about, but it was a great civilization that also may have had a trade route all the way to Persia, also to, in some cases, even to China. They found coins there from India showing that this was the ancient trade route. So when the Greeks came down the Red Sea, they depended on Ethiopia to bring them items from that area. And one of the ancient structures that are still there, and at one point during this lecture, I may move a little fast if I see the time is getting away here, because we are in a time period here. But one of the pre-Aksumite structures are still there, and this is Yiha. It is one of the most sacred and ancient places of Ethiopia. And Asbidor, the ancient Ethiopian, around 800 BC, much of this culture we know very little about. It hasn't been talked about in the Western world. It hasn't been brought to you in the school books today. And we come into Aksami, who founded the holy city of Aksum. Aksami, we see the Aksum, which is the holy city. It was the queen's Saba, the capital, and regarded as Ethiopia's second Jerusalem. And here these stellars are still there to this very day. And the earliest known writing is about the empire of Aksum is in what is known as the Parables of the Erythraean Sea. Around 60 AD, the author is supposed to be a Greco-Egyptian. But they talked about how great this civilization was of Aksum. The Persian sage Mani, who lived around the 3rd century AD, recorded the empire of Aksum among the 4 great kingdoms of the world, and along with Persia, Rome, and China. And this structure here, although the largest stela that was built is now fallen. I mean, this structure here was over 500 tons and over 100 feet tall. The largest stela or tekenu, known as obelisks, ever built in the ancient world. And the story is told that elephants were used to carry these ancient stelas and prop them up in this area. And we know about when Mary was going to talk about Mussolini came in. Mussolini had an agenda that goes all the way back to Augustus Caesar, who had an expedition at this time trying to take over Ethiopia around 29 BCE. So they've been doing this for a long time that she's going to get more in detail with. This was also tried by the Roman Nero around 54 to 68 AD on the pretext of seeking the source of the Nile, just like James Bruce, who we already knew about the beginning of the Nile. It said it on the ancient texts, that we came from the beginning of the Nile where God happy dwelt at the foothill of the mountain of the moon. So here we see this stela here is still standing, and recently Italy had to return one that they stole. And I think they need to still return all the treasures that they stole up out of Africa. I think they need to return the tekenu that what Constantine took that is still right there in St. Peter's Square. That is your tekenu that came up out of the Nile Valley. So when you look at these ancient stellars, here these massive stellars that were built where they still can't figure out how they were using the technology to build these stellars. As I said, the largest one in the ancient world, over 500 tons and over 100 feet tall, there's now fallen. This one here is still standing, about 70 feet tall, but you can see that it's part of the African Nile Valley culture with the tekenus of ancient Egypt, that is all one African Nile Valley civilization. When we go up into the land of Aksum, you see the ruins of Makeda that we call Sheba. The places where she's from, it was Aksum, Ethiopia. And this is the ruins of her palace there. The story that we know about Makeda comes from the Kaba Nages and the Father Nages of the Royal Ethiopian Chronicles and oral tradition. The story is derived from the biblical account and also in the Quran. But when we understand and see that the story, when we and look into the Quran, it talks about the story of Makeda making her expedition back down the Red Sea into the land of Jerusalem. But when we look and see how we got the Kaba Nages today, brothers and sisters, it's through Wallace Budge. He's the one who retranslated it when James Bruce took these sacred writings, stole these sacred writings from Gundar. And they were retranslated by Wallace Budge, and Wallace Budge is the one who told us that Makeda was not from Ethiopia, she was from Arabia. But prior to that, even the Portuguese, even during their time in Ethiopia, saying that she was from Axum, so why should Wallace Budge come much later and change it? Like we see Francisco Alvarez in 1520 said that Axum was Makeda's home. But Europeans were trying to remove the history of Ethiopia and bring it somewhere else, because here we see a biblical account that they don't want to have anything associated with Africa. Even the name Ethiopia in Genesis has been removed, and the New American Bible now is Cush, and Cush is somewhere else, they said, not in Africa. So it's got to be moved out of Africa, even though in Genesis chapter 10, the sons of Cush were Saba and Havilah, and we see other various names, and also Sheba is associated with that. If we look in chapter 43, verse 3, am I going too fast? Okay, because I want to move along here, because I don't want to take up all the time. In chapter 43, verse 3 of the book of Isaiah, the land of Sheba is named along with the lands of Cush and Egypt. In chapter 60, verse 6 of Isaiah, it alludes to Sheba's wealth. So here we see again from the biblical account, it associates it with Cush or Ethiopia. And when we look at the Kaba Nages, as I said, it was called the Glory of the Kings. From the 4th century is a translation from the Coptic original found before 325 AD. It was written in the 14th century by Nebri Ed Yashik, who he translated from a Coptic original. So this is a very old book that existed even before European Christianity. But in the Kaba Nages, it speaks of Tebrin, the trade minister of Queen Makeda, or Saba, that we know as Sheba, where Solomon puts out the call that he wants to build the great temple and build the ark. And he was looking for great wealth and treasures to be brought back to the temple to build this structure. Timrid made the call, and this is the trade minister of Makeda. He returned to Ethiopia and told Makeda about the story of this king named Solomon. The queen of Seba, or Sheba, the name Sheba is Saba, as I said in Ethiopian language. In the New Translation or the New Testament, she is called the Queen of the South, which means in Ge'ez, Negesta Azib, or mean the Queen of the South. Azibis, the Queen of the South, and the Kebra Nages, she is called Makeda. The Arabs refer to her as Queen Belkis. So we see the story is told in both Hebrew, Christian, and Muslim texts. So we see a relevancy to the story. And here she starts to make her expedition to meet this king who's building this ark and building the temple for Jehovah. In the Kaba Nages in the Bible, Makeda is also referred to as Candace. Now, why is she referred to as Candace also in the Kaba Nages? Because that is the Christian, queen who also brought Christianity in Ethiopia that I'm going to talk about. After all, she is a Meroitic queen that I'm going to talk about in a few minutes. Now, she makes her expedition to the land of Israel, and she makes her expedition down the Red Sea, and here we see she meets Solomon, as is told in 1 Kings chapter 10. It tells of her great wealth. And here it also talks about the train of riches that she brought to Solomon. And when Queen Sheba heard of the fame of Solomon concerning the name of the Lord, she came to prove him with hard questions. And she came to Jerusalem with a very great train with camels of bird, spices, and very much gold. So here, this is the land of gold. It was always referred to the land of gold. Even Nubi means land of gold. So again, this was a very rich land. But keep in mind that the connection of Makeda and Solomon, this is an old story because all the patriarchs all took Cushite women, as I said before. Abraham, Joseph, Moses, and you're going to deal with the Zagwe dynasty in a few minutes, who they aligned themselves with Moses marrying the Cushite woman. So this is an ancient story. Now, Africa represented a matrilineal system. The Cushites said that you had to be born of the goddess womb. So their system was matrilineal. Now the story of Makeda is a patriarchal story. Now that is not indigenous to the Nile Valley. So that is a change up here when we see the patriarch is now part of the legacy of Ethiopia, even though it becomes a physical and religious story of Ethiopia and becomes the religious history of Ethiopia. And we see the Songs of Solomon. It says, I am black, but comely, O ye daughters of Jerusalem, as the tents of Kedar, as the curtains of Solomon. Now Solomon, now we know that he was not a white man, could not have been a white man living in that particular area of the world. And Makeda clearly saying what she is right here, I am black and comely. Now in the Greek version, she says, I am black and beautiful. But now when it gets to the King James Version, they change it. I am black but comely. That's why you've got to understand that they have translated and retranslated various books all the time. That's why you can't get stuck with one book. So the Eurocentric version of it, of course, they can't have her being an African. She can't be an African. So now, to keep you away from the African connection, here we see they now are both white here, as I refer to as a muranthropoid. Okay, it's like at Stanford, you know, that's from my own scientific observation. But again, they had to make them look this way because they did not want to see you in the Bible. Although it says, I am black but comely. Although corrupted, when first it was, I am black and beautiful. So right in your face, they changed this. And then, of course, we got one sculpture of her black. And then they had to make up another psychopathic racist description by saying, well, when she becomes baptized, she'll become white. That's why she got her blonde hair ready for the baptismal. So you got to understand that someone knows something about you that they don't want you to know about yourself. That's why racism is prevalent in everything you do. Everything you do. In your educational system, in your political system, in your civilization, everything you do is based off of their own psychopathic racism to remove you, and then I'm supposed to be quiet. I can't say nothing about it. But in Kings it says that, and she gave the king 120 talents of gold and spices, very great store, and precious stones. So here we see right here that also the navy also of Harem that brought gold from Hafar. Now Afar is Afar in the eastern region of Ethiopia. And here through their union, although in the Kabernagis, it speaks of that Solomon tricked Makeda in the bed. That's what it says in the Kabernagis, but she was tricked, saying that she was not to eat or drink of anything of the palace. And then he gave her all this spice. And of course she wanted to drink, and he said, you can't take of anything of the palace. That was our agreement. She says, but I'm thirsty. So then she had to give herself to Solomon. Now, that's in the Kabernagis. So here they have a union. Between the two of them, they have a son named Ebna Hakim. And Ebna Hakim is Menelik, the first that I'll deal with in a minute. But now we see the precious stones that came from Ethiopia enabled Solomon to build the Ark of the Covenant. Now the Ark of the Covenant is supposed to be the sacred house of Jehovah. And here we see two cherubims or angel-like figures are on top of the ark. And this is supposed to be the portable God house. And they carried this ark into war. They also had a holy place called the Ankh Manu for the holies of the ark. But the ark is an ancient story, brothers and sisters. It's an ancient Cushite story that came from the Nile Valley with the cherubims and angels on the sacred tombs and also on the reliefs of ancient Kemet, showing the ark is an ancient story long before this time period. When we look in Exodus, it says, and the cherubim shall stretch forth their wings on high, covering the mercy seat, which I just showed you. With their wings and their faces shall stretch, look one to another towards the mercy seat. Shall face the cherubims. Then we go down to 22, and there I will meet with thee, and I will commune with thee from above the mercy seat, from between the two cherubims which are upon the ark. Well, if you go and see that the Cushite Kemet, you see the two cherubims facing one another, and Amun-Ra in between the two of them, just as you read it in chapter 22, where Jehovah God will meet and commune between the two cherubims which are upon the ark. So this is an ancient story long before this one was told. But this is an ancient Cushite story, and even in the Holies of Holies, where the ark was placed in Solomon's temple, although we got a sketch of the hypostyle hall, but Kemet, we can still see this same story. But here we see this ark was carried in the war. It's supposed to have leveled mountains and everything. I mean, it was something else. But also in Kemet, the portable god house of Amun was carried by the priests of Amun, just like the ark was carried among the Hebrews. But when you go into Kemet and you see Waset, or the temple of Ipidasut, where the ark of Amun was taken out of the Holies of Holies and placed right here in the hypostyle hall, here you see the hypostyle hall and the Holies of Holies and the ark and Solomon, a sketch of Solomon's temple. But when you go back to Africa, there's no sketch. You see the actual thing. So this is an ancient story of ancient Kushite Ethiopia that's been passed down for thousands of years. But as we got the story, Menelik makes his journey back to Jerusalem to see his father. And he returns back, and keep in mind that Solomon does not have another son, because after all, Rehoboam, his second son, is a very young man, and Menelik is his first son. So that tells us that the Hebrew faith and the original Hebrews are right there in Ethiopia. Here he also took the ark because Solomon said take a son of each tribe with Menelik back to Ethiopia. And Azariah, went back to Ethiopia with Menelik I, and this is the story that we got how the Hebrew faith came into Ethiopia. And there's one story accounted in the Kebra Nagast that he stole the ark because he was infuriated of how his mother was tricked to get into bed with Solomon. But as we got the story, that shouldn't be there, here we see the priest returned back to Ethiopia. Now keep in mind, the ark is the cornerstone of the faith of Ethiopia. And here we look at this and see as he returns back, Menelik brought the ark to Tanakakos. This is a sacred place in Lake Tana in Ethiopia where the ark was brought. This is what made Ethiopia a Hebrew nation at this particular time. They were not Christians. They were Hebrews during this time, and Menelik is the one that brought the Hebrew faith and practiced the Hebrew religion during this particular period. And in Gundar, you can still see the tukels with a Mogenda'u or Star David on top of the tukels, or the synagogue that you see right here. So the faith, and you see, again, this validates that the origin of it came up out of Nile Valley. And I'm going to go a little faster here because I'm looking at the clock. And some of our sisters who are of the Hebrew faith are still there in Ethiopia, although many of them were airlifted up to taken back to Jerusalem, and many of their culture has been stripped in many cases and forced to practice a European Ashkenazi, European version of the faith, who they are not the beginning of it all, at all. They practiced the original Torah, and they refused to accept the Babylonian Talmud because that's the racist version that they put in there, that we were cursed black. So this is at the conference where they got together at the conference of Jamnia and made this story up. But here in Gundar, you can see some of the Hebrews who are still there in Ethiopia to this day, and they come out with this book called The Lost Jews. They said, we're not lost, we're right here in Ethiopia. They said, you must be lost. You must be lost. You see at the Belfire Conference, where England and the United States still gangstering on the world then, and as they're doing now with Iraq. Here they took the land off the Palestinians and gave it to the European Jews who were being persecuted by Hitler during that time. They wanted their homeland, they took the land. Also, we see the news reports. It talks about Ethiopia, the black Jews, and building in the wilderness. And we see the accounts that, as I said, the term Falasha, which is that they, in the E's means stranger, although that is, they call themselves Beta Israel. They refer to themselves. And also they speak of in this article that their religion, however, they say is a primitive brand of Judaism. How could it be primitive when they're practicing from the original first 5 books of Moses, as the story goes? Theirs must be primitive. They made it up because they refute, and it says right here, and it is based almost entirely on the biblical sources, and until they were discovered by Europeans in the 19th century, they had never heard of the Talmud, because the Talmud is the one the Europeans brought on. As we see, the rabbinical establishment in Israel is also suspicious about the lack of documentation on their origin. I mean, they should be suspicious of them. Okay? They're suspicious. But doesn't it say in Amos chapter 9, verse 7, are ye not as the children of Ethiopia unto me, O children of Israel? Okay, saith the Lord. Dr. Yosef Yakin, he's also at Agag. His family background also goes back to the African Hebrews in the highlands of Ethiopia, and I was with him in 1981 when he returned back to visit his family. And his book, Read the Black Jews, is a great book to read about them as I deal with them in my African history versus biblical myths. This is a good book to get also Bila Gide and the Ethiopian civilization. And in this book, he speaks of the history of ancient Ethiopia and its sovereign rulers, traces back to about 5,000 years. He also speaks of the names of 237 kings and emperors that starting from Menelik I, okay, and Queen Solomon and Queen Makeda or Saba. And let's look at the lineage, okay? And we look at the lineage and see that these names are African Kemetic, Cushite Kemetic, like Amenhotep. Amenhotep is Amenhotep III over 3,000 years ago. If you look at other names like, okay, we know about Aksami, who started the Aksumite, okay, the holy city, but the second